Why some peoples, in our world, are born bottom, and lived in equality. Why some are born low, and lived unrespected. Why some are born miserable, and lived in injustice. Why some are born poor, and lived inhuman, because of their races, nations, their beliefs, religions, all their cultures, ethnicity.
Talking about Canadian Indigenous funding and finance, how do they work in Canada? According to the Government of Canada website, in 2020, the government developed a $305 million Distinctions-Based Indigenous Community Support Fund, through the COVID-19 Economic Response Plan, to address immediate needs in Indigenous communities. A direct $145.2 million to Indigenous communities, and a further $159.8 million for indigent organizations, serving those living off reserve. Given 2020's governmental funding and finance for the Indigenous communities, the money under the policy could be a complicated subject. In fact, some of the biggest conflicts between federal government and Indigenous communities have been stemmed from the subject of funding and finance. In this article, I will provide reader a general overview about the field of Indigenous finance and funding in Canada. The Indigenous funding and finance agreements are renewed every year, however not always on time. Oftentimes Indigenous communities have to reallocate funds from elsewhere to continue meeting community service requirements. The federal government establishes each community as an autonomous entity and, thus, provides separate program funding to each community. The federal government understands the demands from the Canadian Indigenous communities. However, a lack of clarity about the overall objectives and a lack of coherence among funding arrangements prevent the federal funding from providing services on reserves of the same range and quality as those provided to other communities across the nation.
To talk today.
The Coquitlam First Nation is home to just 81 people, only 35 of which actually live on the reserve. Last year, Chief Ron Giesbrecht took home nearly $1 million in salary and bonuses. But today, he didn't want to take our questions about his enormous income.
I know this story is important to you guys. It is to me as well, because I have to answer to my people, and I'm doing that right now.
He's promising to have an update on his pay next Wednesday, but then he stopped talking.
Sir?
The documents posted online show he took home $914,000 last year, plus he expensed an additional $16,000. He says it was good value because the majority of that money was a bonus for bringing economic development to the territory.
So are they angry?
Because Giesbrecht lives on a reserve, the money is tax-free. In a statement, the Aboriginal Affairs Minister said the reported salary of the chief is very troubling and his community members deserve an explanation. Now, one former First Nations chief is also looking for an explanation. Grand Chief Doug Kelly says the numbers just don't make sense. 4 years ago, a global news investigation found the chief and 3 councillors of a Nova Scotia community were getting $1.7 million in salary and compensation in 2008. And because so few First Nations have reported their salaries, there are fears that this could be just the tip of the iceberg. Mike Lecouteur, Global News, Ottawa.
We focus on the underprivileged grassroots, to have their own voices, shout loud to the world.